Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be holy and pleasing to you, our Lord, our rock, and our Redeemer. Amen. So there's an old story about two rabbis, Rabbi Hillel and Rabbi Shammai. They were sitting together when one day a foreigner comes up to Rabbi Shammai and asks him a question, and he says, "Teacher, I will convert to Judaism if you can teach me the whole law while I stand on one foot." Kind of a trick question, I guess. Shammai looked at the man and scoffed. How arrogant, how ridiculous, how lazy even to think the whole Jewish law could be summed up in such a little amount of time that it takes you to stand on one foot. All right? Nobody can stand on one foot for long. Neither can the law be summed up in such a short time. Rabbi Hillel, however, leaned over to the foreigner and said, "That which is despicable to you, do not do to anyone." That's the whole of the law. The rest, commentary. Legend has it that the guy converted right on the spot. In today's reading from the Gospel of Luke, we get something similar to what Rabbi Hillel said, but it's also remarkably different too. Listen to how Jesus frames things in Luke chapter 6, verse 27 through 31. "But I say to you that listen, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, turn the other one also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you, and if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them again. Do to others as you would have them do to you." That last line, of course, is the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do to you. Rabbi Hillel's version goes by a different name. We call it the silver rule. It had nothing to do with William Jennings Bryan, if you know anything about American history, all right? It was called the silver rule. Can you tell the difference between the silver rule and the golden rule? The silver rule teaches that we shouldn't do what we find despicable or hated, things that we hate to anyone else, right? Don't do bad things to others, right? Don't do what you would find to be harmful to other people. So this is what we might call a prohibitive rule. It tries to get us to stop doing or not to do at all bad things to other people, right? Don't do it. Don't do bad things to other people. The golden rule, however, is a little bit different. It's what we might call generative. It generates something. It creates. It's trying to get us to do good things. Not just resist doing bad things. The golden rule wants us to do good things. So it's active, it's generative, it creates. Both of these, the silver rule and the golden rule, are good. They're good rules, but they're not exactly the same. They're not exactly the same, which we can see in the fact that Judaism actually has its own version of the golden rule. Do to others as you would have them do to you is a call then to actively work for the good of your neighbor. It's a call to be active in what we do. Last week we started a new series, ripped shamelessly from a book by Scott McKnight and Laura Behringer, called A Church Called Tov, Forming a Goodness Culture that Resists Abuses of Power and Promotes Healing. I spent a whole lot of money and bought all the deacons and staff one of these books because I so thoroughly enjoyed it and think it's so important for us today. And so we're going to be going over it in some form and fashion throughout the season of Lent that is coming up. Tov, so the church called Tov. Tov, as we learned last week, is a little Hebrew word that means good. And in the context of Scripture, to be good is more than just making sure we don't do bad things. It's not just the silver rule. To be good, Tov, is the golden rule. It means actively doing what is right and what is righteous. In other words, what is good. So today I want to talk a little bit about how we start up doing that, how we can go about doing that, how we may be able to get there to that doing goodness. How do we be good today? How do we become not only good people individually, you and me, but also a good church, hopefully a good city, a good nation, a good world? All right, how do we do this? How do we do this? So we want to be a church that is known for being good, first and foremost. And what's important about that is it means we're not wanting, first and foremost, to be a church that's known for being big or being popular. Those things, by the way, are outside of our control. They're outside of our control. What we can control is how we live and think and act. We can control those things. So how do we live, think, and act in a way that is recognizably good? If goodness is our goal, then how do we get there? The answer, I think, is kind of pithy and simple. We take the next step. We take the next step. And then the next one, and then the next one, always the next step. My brother Justin and I were talking the other day when I happened to be down in Texas for this conference, and I mentioned to him how I have very little tolerance for my kids' pain. This is true fact, true story, confession time. Very little tolerance for my kids' pain. Let's say Marty stubs his toe, all right? Stubs his toe and comes to me crying. You would think that, a good, loving parent would hug him, console him, would say, Marty, I'm so sorry you hurt. Come let me hold you until it all gets better. We'll put a Band-Aid on it. We'll get some ice. Maybe we'll watch a show. I'll get you a popsicle. I love you, son. Let's be together. That would be nice. Maybe a bit much, but it'd be nice. But that's not what I do. I basically say this: suck it up. I hardly even look at him. I'm like, dude, you stubbed your toe. I stub my toe all the time, all right? I don't cry about it. Suck it up, all right? Suck it up. And then I move on. I don't hug the little guy, all right? I don't console him. My goal is simply to get him to stop crying and go back to whatever he was doing. So I'm telling my brother this, and I'm feeling guilty about it. And I'm like, what do I do, Justin? Am I really just a bad parent? Am I just a terrible person? Do I not really care about my kids' feelings? Am I really that callous? I mean, this is just like, he asks, and my gut goes, stop it, you're done, it's fine. And so my brother, in all his wisdom, goes, I got a podcast for you. And I'm like, podcast? I come to you for an answer, and you send me to a podcast. But the podcast was great, all right? It was about the psychology of attachment. Anybody know about the theory of attachment in psychology, the psychology of attachment? Okay, psychology of attachment and how the attachments that we develop as children especially influence how we come to attach to our kids. And I'm already thinking, thank God, I'm about to be able to blame my parents. All right? So I'm listening to this podcast, and they start to describe a kind of attachment that's called dismissive avoidant. And I think, oh no. Dismissive avoidant attachment is all about how a parent dismisses a child's cries for help. Maybe her feelings for pain, all right? And the way the parent does this is either by just outright ignoring, like not even hearing the kid or pretending not to, or suggesting that she handle things differently. Suck it up. Stop crying. And so I hear this on the podcast, and I'm like, oh no, that's me. That's totally me. I'm teaching my kids to be callous and uncaring. What I do, they're going to learn, and then they're going to be this to my grandkids, and it's all going to be my fault. I'm ruining their future. And like on cue, the podcast goes, now for all of you worried parents out there, and I'm like, thank God, they're going to tell me it's okay. They said, just breathe. Just breathe. It's silly, but I literally have, so this is stepping back a little, I literally have this fear. I have this fear that somehow I'm ruining my children, all right, my own problems I'm just putting into them, and they're going to be warped beyond repair. Come to find out, a lot of parents actually feel this way with young kids. We always feel like we're messing them up, but it's based on a false idea that the only way It's based on this false idea that the only way to be a good parent is to be perfect. The only way to be a good parent is to be perfect all the time, 24/7, as if the only thing our kids absorb is the very first thing that we pour into them. So if I go, suck it up, son, then, well, man, he's just going to be a rugged individualist and hate everybody and be callous for the rest of his life, and I'm going to pay for it, or something like this, right? The reality, however, is that nobody's perfect. We know this, right? Nobody's perfect. We can't be perfect. As we work over the next few weeks into Lent on how to create this goodness culture in our churches, in our lives, as we work over this, there's something we have to remember, that we're not perfect, that nobody's perfect. That's why we're in this spot, and we don't have to be perfect going forward, all right? But this doesn't mean that we can't change and be better. Studies have shown that even when we dismiss or avoid our kids' pain, that doesn't have to be the end of it. I don't know about you, but when I dismiss my son's pain, he doesn't just all of a sudden go, suck it up. Great, that makes sense. Here we go. Play with some Legos some more. All right? What does he end up doing? He goes, and goes to the couch and gets his blanket and cries under the blanket for like twice as long as he would have been if I had just held the kid, right? And so I'm sitting there doing dishes or writing a sermon or whatever I'm doing that is less important than comforting my kid, and I get all guilty feeling. And so I go over to my son and I hug him and I hold him and I say, I'm sorry. I shouldn't have yelled at you. I should have comforted you. I messed up. We're not doomed to being bad parents, and our kids aren't doomed to repeating our mistakes because there's always that next step that we can take. Do you know what is just as helpful as not dismissing or avoiding your kids' pain? It's when you see them crying afterwards, probably suffering from something more than just a stubbed toe, but the disappointment of a parent not loving them the way that they felt like they needed to be cared for, not comforting them, and then the parent coming and saying, hey, buddy, I messed up. Can we hold it out? Can we hug it out a little bit? All right, can I comfort you? This is what psychologists call rupture and repair. Rupture and repair. Repairing the ruptures we cause in our relationships can be just as powerful as never rupturing the relationships in the first place. We can take the next step. Just because we failed in the past doesn't mean we can't be good in the future. There's always the next step. Last week, I talked about this church in Kentucky where 20 years after the fact, they found out that one of their youth ministers had been having inappropriate sexual contact with some of his youth. The guy had been gone for like a decade. The pastor who was leading the church now wasn't even there when any of this happened, but they took ownership of it, and they made sure that they apologized to everybody who was involved. Everybody was hurt. Even the town of Lexington, they apologized for it. All right? Rupture and repair. Taking the next step. Changing direction, doing good. Over the next few weeks, this is what I think we're going to need to remember. In the rupture, goodness comes in the repair. As we begin to look at a number of ways that we've been shaped by our churches and our culture and even our theology, that no matter how much we may sugarcoat them, aren't very good. And how do we prepare that? How do we repair that? We can change. That's the message of the gospel, by the way, right? We call it the good news for a reason. That God, through the incarnation, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, gives us the grace and the ability to change. We're never stuck as we might think we are. We're never stuck. And that's because of God. All right. Now, if that's the motivational speaker side of the sermon, you may be like, oh no, there's another half. And so here it comes. All right. We're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of that change that we're going to be experiencing and this culture of goodness that Jesus is trying to instill here in Luke chapter 6. What does this step look like? What does it look like, and how do we take it? Jesus begins in verse 27 with a line that is almost as familiar to folks as John 3:16. But I say to you, love your enemies. Do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you. Pray for those who abuse you. Famous line. Then he goes on, of course, says, turn the other cheek Sums it all up in the golden rule: do unto others as you would have them do unto you. This is like the third time I've read these to you today. The question is, why? Why should we do that? Why should we turn the other cheek? Forget for a moment this image of, well, Jesus is God or something like this. Just ask yourself, why should we do that? Why should we do it? Why turn the other cheek? Why do unto others as you would have them do to you? Why love our enemies? After all, even the Old Testament says an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Why can't we go with that one? Jesus' command here to love our enemies seems to go against our very understanding of fairness, maybe even justice. It's hard to say, I'm going to love my enemy and let them hit me on the other side. Why? They're in the wrong. They're in the wrong. They should be punished for this. Jesus says, if anyone takes away your coat, give them also your shirt. They stole my coat, and now you're telling me to give them more. No, they should give me my coat back. That makes sense. This is why we litigate. It's why we spend a lot of money on lawyers and courts and things like this for fairness' sake, right? If anyone steals from you, don't try to get it back. Where is justice in that, Jesus? There's not even an attempt at reforming people here, right? We just let them do what they want. What is Jesus playing at? He seems to be throwing all fairness and justice out to the wind. Just listen to his next few lines. If you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. If you lend to those whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. If you are a banker and you control loans, beware. Jesus has it in for you. All right? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies, Jesus says. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return. By the way, if you ever give Sarah and me Tupperware or pie pans or anything like this, beware. Don't expect anything in return. We're terrible at giving things back like that. I'll eat the pie. I just won't give you the pan back. Not because I mean to. I'm not trying to steal it. I just don't think about it. All right, anyways, that's another matter. In other words, we're not talking about fairness, Jesus says. This whole thing, actually, come to find out, is not about fairness. He says, love your enemies, do good, and lend, expecting nothing in return. He says it's not about fairness. You're right. This isn't about fairness. It's not about what you think is just. It's about something else, he says. Sinners are fair to other sinners, well and good. You're fair to those who treat you fairly, well and good. But Jesus seems to be saying this golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, and the command to love your enemies as yourselves, this isn't about fairness at all. Fairness is the way of the world. He's not saying don't be unfair. He's just saying that's not our MO. Our MO is something different. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that's fair. In Matthew's gospel, Jesus, by the way, rejects that very line explicitly. He says, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist the evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also to him. It's not about fairness. For Jesus, love supersedes even fairness. There's something more important. I think the problem many of us might have with this passage is it ends up sounding weak. It ends up sounding weak. If we do what Jesus says, aren't we giving in? Aren't we even pushing against other things that he says? If we simply let people walk all over us, how can we possibly stand up for what is right and what is good? How can we do that? But I don't think that's actually what's going on here. Jesus is actually pointing out something about the way of the world and the character of our culture and how our culture thinks and how we're trained to think within it. And he says, if you're going to be my people, my disciples, if you want to know what it truly means to do good, real good, then you have to love your enemies. Then you need to follow a different logic. And this is the logic of absolute radical love, he says. It doesn't mean giving in. This isn't about giving in. It doesn't mean letting people walk all over you. In fact, it means taking the initiative. You have to take the initiative. Just think about it. When people hate or curse or abuse or steal from you, they're the ones in power. They're using that power. They're calling the shots. They're expressing with their words and the actions how they think the world is supposed to work. They're in control. You can see this, by the way, real easily in Matthew's version of this saying, where Jesus adds a scenario about someone being forced to carry a Roman soldier's bag for a mile. Jesus asks the audience, the ones who are listening to his story, he says, "What should we do after carrying that bag for a while? Should we give it back?" And he says, "No, don't give it back. Carry it for another mile." So you carry it for 2. Why? But why do that? It takes the initiative. All of a sudden, the one who is being abused becomes the one who is in control. They take the initiative. Just think, what would going that extra mile make the soldier think? He literally just used his power and authority to force you to do something against your will, but by going the extra mile, you took that will back and showed a different way of living and being in the world. You gained the power in that situation, but here's the difference, and it's the most important difference. Instead of being a power used to coerce and to hate, it's now a power used to love and to care, even sacrificially. So this is not Jesus promoting weakness. This is Jesus promoting strength, but strength that is intended to lead to change in the individual and in the widespread culture. Jesus isn't just saying, love your enemy, let them walk all over you, but love your enemy, and by doing so, show them a better way to be. Walter Wink tells a story about how this very idea played itself out most vividly during the civil rights movement. I'm just going to read it to you because he tells it well. One evening during the turbulent weeks when Selma, Alabama, Wink says, when Selma was the focal point of the civil rights struggle, a large crowd of black and white activists were standing outside the Ebenezer Baptist Church. This was Dr. King's church. And they were electrified by the sudden arrival of a black funeral home operator from Montgomery. And this funeral home operator reported that a group of black students had been demonstrating near the Capitol just that afternoon, and they had been surrounded by police on horseback. All their escape had been barred, and they were cynically commanded to disperse or take the consequences. And then the mounted police waded into the students and beat them at will. Police prevented ambulances from reaching the injured for 2 hours. The crowd outside the church heard this news and began to seethe with rage, Wink says. Cries went up. "Let's march," they yelled. Behind them across the street, however, stood rank on rank the Alabama State Troopers and the local police forces of Sheriff Jim Clark. The situation was explosive. A young black minister stepped to the microphone and said, "It's time we sang a song." He opened with the line, "Do you love Martin King?" To which those who knew the song responded, "Certainly, Lord." It's a play off of a line in the book of Amos. He kept going, "Do you love Martin King?" They said, "Certainly, certainly, certainly, Lord." Right through the chain of command in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was the group that King was leading. The crowd kept singing, "Certainly, certainly, certainly, Lord. We love them." And then without warning, that black preacher sang out, "And do you love Jim Clark?" And they go, "The sheriff? Do you love Jim Clark?" The sheriff who was standing there with his horses, hovering over them, the obvious sign of black oppression. And the crowd responded a little more hesitantly, certainly, Lord." "Do you love Jim Clark?" "Certainly, Lord," they sang a little louder now. "Do you love Jim Clark?" And the point began to sink in. Another minister took the mic and said, "We're not just fighting for our rights. We're fighting for the good of the whole society. It's not enough to defeat Jim Clark." And then he raised his eyes and looked straight at the sheriff. Do you hear me, Jim? He said. Do you hear me, Jim? It's not enough to defeat you. We want you converted. We cannot win by hating you. We can only win by loving you into changing. Jesus says this is the power of the golden rule. It's taking the initiative in order to encourage change, even if that requires sacrifice. No wonder then that back in Luke 6, Jesus adds that the original example of all this is God himself. When we love our enemies and do unto others as we would have them do unto us, we're simply doing what God does. Love your enemies, Jesus says in verse 35. Love your enemies, do good, lend, expecting nothing in return, for your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High. For he is kind to the ungrateful and to the wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. I've shared a number of times this past month, here and elsewhere, a story about a Catholic nun named Sister Madonna Buter. She's known as the Iron Nun. I absolutely love this story, which is why I keep sharing it. But there's a side to this story that I haven't told. Sister Buter, who holds the world record for being the oldest woman to ever finish an Ironman triathlon, she did it at the age of 82 and has kept doing it, by the way. She was asked to speak at the opening dinner for an Ironman going on a few years ago in Vancouver, and she began her talk like this. This is a small, pretty petite woman, but she's fit. She runs triathlons, obviously. She goes, some of you have trained for years, even decades. And I'm paraphrasing, but this is what she says. Some of you have trained for years, even decades for this moment, for this one race. You've been training, and yet you have no idea what tomorrow will bring. It could bring tragedy. Halfway through that swim, your leg could cramp up, and you'd be calling for help so you don't drown. When you get onto those hills on that bike, those slick hills in Vancouver, your bike could slide out from underneath you. You could lose traction and go crashing into others, taking plenty out with you. You don't know what's going to come. And if you are lucky enough to make it to the marathon, you're not guaranteed to finish. Even the best often don't finish this race. Tomorrow, disaster might be waiting for you. But then she leaned over and says, remember this. Remember this. No matter what accidents befall you tomorrow, no matter what happens at the last minute, if you tragically collapse with the finish line in sight, remember this. You were loved into existence. You were loved by God into existence. That's the story, but the other side of it is just as important. God also loved your enemy into existence. God loved the whole world into existence. Every act, every good life, every good culture, every good church begins with that knowledge that God loved not only you into existence, but the people you hate. God loved your neighbor. God loved your enemy into existence and still loves them. Goodness begins there. Let's remember that this Lent. Amen.